A hidden truth, long buried, is finally coming to light. Would you dare face the deepest secrets of your own life? The ones that haunt you, keeping you awake at night, following you at every turn. In this story, the search for a truth no one ever imagined begins. But once uncovered, nothing will ever be the same again. To truly understand, you must step beyond your own assumptions. Are you ready? Mrs. Emmeline Harcourt was a woman of unshakable order, a quiet guardian of routine. Her life unfolded like the pages of a well-worn book, predictable and serene. Her home, Ivy Bank House, stood as a monument to her dedication to cleanliness and structure, every room pristine, every detail carefully arranged. Tea was served at precisely the same hour, and her parlor gleamed with the kind of perfection that spoke of years spent in solitude. In truth, there was a soothing comfort to the regularity of her life, a sanctuary where nothing dared disrupt the calm. But one spring morning, while undertaking her annual ritual of spring cleaning, a task she performed with the reverence of someone attending a religious ceremony, she uncovered something that would disturb the very peace she had so carefully cultivated. The task began as any other. She pulled back the edge of the Persian rug in the parlor, intending to polish the floorboards beneath. The rug had been in place for years, its fabric worn smooth from decades of use. With a sharp tug, she began to lift it, but then her fingers froze, a sudden unease prickling her skin. Beneath the rug, on the floorboards, was a stain. It was dark, a rust-colored blotch that seemed strangely out of place, too deliberate, too hidden. It nestled under the rug in a spot so precisely centered that it felt as though it had been placed there with intent. A faint unease crept into Mrs. Harcourt's chest. She bent down, instinctively brushing her hand over it, as though the mere touch could reveal its secrets. Her eyes scanned the stain, her mind trying to process it. It was too dark to be wine, too oddly shaped for spilled jam or polish. And though she had no scientific knowledge of blood, nor any inclination to explore such grim possibilities, something deep inside her recoiled with a sense of recognition, a quiet instinct that whispered that the stain was not as innocent as it appeared. She shook her head, attempting to dismiss the thought. "It's nothing," she told herself. "Just an old spill. Something from long ago, perhaps the Colonel's doing. He was the one who lived here before me, after all." The Colonel, a reclusive gentleman known for his eccentricities, had never been a topic of conversation Mrs. Harcourt had enjoyed. He had been a man of peculiar habits, often seen wandering the property with little regard for order. His housekeeping was notoriously poor, and many village rumors suggested his lifestyle left much to be desired. Still, he had been dead for years, and Mrs. Harcourt had never once suspected that his presence might have left something behind, something so hidden, so unsettling. That afternoon, the stain lingered in her thoughts, unsettling her in a way she couldn't quite shake. She found herself walking to St. Mary's ivy-wrapped cottage, the one with the garden blooming with lavender, where Miss Marple, the village's soft-spoken but sharp-eyed elder, resided. Mrs. Harcourt had no grand intentions. She simply meant to borrow a pie dish. But as she sat across from Miss Marple, the words began to spill out, as though the weight of the mystery could no longer be contained. She explained everything. The stain, the way it had been tucked so carefully beneath the rug, the odd, almost deliberate nature of its placement. Miss Marple listened quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression soft but her eyes bright with a quiet understanding. She said nothing for a long while, simply tilting her head in that knowing way she had when she was processing a thought that others would overlook. But when Mrs. Harcourt mentioned the Colonel, Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "I remember him," Miss Marple said slowly, her voice cool but filled with an odd distant warmth. "A man of many stories, none of them quite true. He had a fondness for his naval swords, though I always suspected he'd never seen salt water in his life." Mrs. Harcourt's heart skipped a beat. "You knew him?" she asked, almost in disbelief. Miss Marple nodded slightly, her gaze distant, as if recalling something hidden in the recesses of her memory. "I didn't know him well, but there was something unsettling about him. And then there was Clara, the housemaid. She disappeared one evening, quite suddenly, vanished without a trace. Her voice lingered on the last word, and Mrs. Harcourt felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Clara, she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Yes, Miss Marple said, her voice quiet now, almost regretful. She had always seemed unhappy, but the circumstances of her disappearance, well, they were never fully explained. It was all rather strange. There was a heavy silence between them, thick with unsaid words. Miss Marple paused for a moment, her gaze flicking back to Mrs. Harcourt before she set down her teacup with a soft clink. "I'd like to come by tomorrow, if you don't mind," she said, her tone casual, but with an underlying weight that made Mrs. Harcourt's stomach tighten. "I'll take a look at the stain myself. Sometimes, things that have been hidden away for so long, well, they have a way of revealing themselves when least expected." The next morning, as promised, Miss Marple arrived promptly at 10 o'clock. She moved with quiet grace, her fingers barely brushing the edge of the stained floorboards. There was no rush, no hurried examination. Instead she took her time, bending low, her fingers gliding over the surface with a careful reverence. The room seemed to hold its breath as she worked, the silence growing heavier with every passing second. Finally, Miss Marple straightened, her face calm, but her eyes narrowing with a sharpness that sent a chill through the room. She turned to Mrs. Harcourt, and spoke in a voice so soft it could have been the wind. "No one ever thinks to look beneath what's right in front of them," she said, "but the past waits patiently, until it is ready to resurface." Mrs. Harcourt blinked, the words sinking into her chest with a heavy weight. "Do you think it's something serious?" she asked, her voice a whisper of uncertainty. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She merely studied the stain again, her gaze steady, as though she were reading the history of the house from the floor beneath them. "I don't know," Miss Marple said finally, her voice thoughtful, "but memories have a way of emerging when least expected. And some of them are harder to forget than others." With that, the long-buried history of Ivy Bank House, of the Colonel's dark secrets and Clara's mysterious disappearance, began to stir beneath the surface, and the quiet tension between them was palpable. Mrs. Harcourt, now caught in the web of the past, could only watch as the mystery slowly unfurled before her. Daniel's arrival in Little Dithering was hardly the spectacle one might expect. His unassuming presence spoke volumes. Dressed in a suit worn at the edges, his satchel fraying at the corners, he was a man of habit, someone who blended into the background so seamlessly that it was almost as if he didn't exist. His manner was quiet, observant and polite to the point of being invisible. His letter of introduction had arrived a week before his physical presence, a letter addressed to Mrs. Emmeline Harcourt, expressing an academic interest in the architectural evolution of small English country houses, particularly those tied to minor military families. The subject was harmless enough, a subject that seemed almost too tame to arouse suspicion. Yet, from the moment he set foot in Ivy Bank House, a subtle but undeniable discomfort began to pervade the air. Daniel was not overtly intrusive. He did not ask bold questions or make demands. But he asked questions that poked at the hidden corners of memory, disturbing the dust that had long settled there. He sought out the history of Colonel Templeton, the former resident of Ivy Bank House, whose life had been a patchwork of military service, eccentricities, and rumors. He probed into the Colonel's movements after the war, the sudden dissolution of the household staff 25 years ago, and the strange gap in the house's history. He spoke to the vicar, the grocer, even to Miss Parsons, the retired music teacher, who had once played the organ at one of the Colonel's garden parties. Each conversation, though polite, seemed to leave a lingering discomfort, a sense of unease that wasn't easy to define. It was never the nature of the questions themselves that unsettled anyone. It was the timing, the unspoken weight behind them. Mrs. Harcourt, having extended her hospitality to Daniel with the blessing of the vicar's wife, had initially found him to be a pleasant, unremarkable guest. He arrived precisely 5 minutes before tea each afternoon, was unobtrusive in every way, and even complimented her on the well-maintained house. But as the days wore on, something shifted. The house, once a sanctuary of order, began to feel charged, as if a crack in the very foundation of its tranquility had appeared. Daniel's questions grew sharper, more specific. He inquired about the floorboards, whether there had ever been any unusual noises at night. He asked if Mrs. Harcourt had ever come across any old letters or correspondence from the Colonel, or if she knew whether any previous tenants had left in haste or under strange circumstances. Mrs. Harcourt, though never one to dismiss a guest's curiosity, began to feel the unease settle deep in her bones. Why did he ask such things? Was it simply academic interest, or something more? Miss Marple, who had made it her habit to visit Mrs. Harcourt under the pretext of dropping off marmalade, or picking up parcels, watched Daniel with a watchful eye. Her curiosity piqued. She noted how he handled memory, as though it were fragile, like precious artifacts that could crumble under the slightest touch. He spoke to the elderly, with a delicate respect, as though each word might unravel a thread of history they had long since tucked away. One afternoon, Daniel paid a visit to Mrs. Dowling, the vicar's wife, whose previous role as an assistant to a district nurse gave her knowledge of the village's older, more troubled history. Their conversation was short, but Miss Marple noticed a shift in Mrs. Dowling's demeanor the next morning, as they crossed paths on the lane. There was a tightness in the woman's lips, a subtle shift in her posture, as though a thought had returned to her, one she had intentionally forgotten. The next evening, as the shadows lengthened, and the soft hum of a coming storm seemed to hover in the air, something strange occurred. Daniel entered the parlor, a slim, well-worn book in hand. After a polite greeting, he made a simple request. "Mrs. Harcourt, may I have a look at the hymnals on the bottom shelf of the bookcase? I believe there may be something inside." Mrs. Harcourt, startled by the request but too polite to refuse, watched as Daniel reached for the thick, leather-bound hymnals. His fingers were careful, deliberate, as if searching for something specific, something hidden. After a moment, he produced a yellowed envelope, tucked between the pages. The envelope was brittle, and its scent, a mingling of old paper and something darker, filled the room. Inside was a single note, its ink faded but still legible. It read simply, "She should never have known. What's done is done. It cannot be risked." The atmosphere in Ivy Bank House shifted in an instant. The quiet tension that had been building for days turned into something more tangible, something that pressed in from all sides. Mrs. Harcourt, for the first time in the week, felt the sharp sting of fear, not of Daniel himself, but of the questions he carried, questions that seemed to have no safe answers. That evening, as she confided in Miss Marple, a strange unease gripped her. She confessed that she now feared not just the letter, but the implications of what had been unearthed. Miss Marple, for her part, returned to her home that evening, with a rare sense of unease settling in her bones. She had long suspected that there were things buried in Little Dithering, things best left undisturbed. And now, with the appearance of this young man, it seemed that those things were no longer content to stay hidden. The mystery had shifted from something academic, a study in history, to something far darker and more pressing. The questions were no longer mere inquiries. They were echoes of a past that had been deliberately forgotten. The village of Little Dithering had always been a quiet place, where time seemed to move in slow, measured steps. But when Daniel Claiborne arrived, the air shifted subtly. His manner, quiet and polite, had initially charmed Mrs. Harcourt, who had given him the guest room upstairs. But it wasn't long before the villagers began to notice something unsettling about the young man's presence. His inquiries into the history of the Templeton family, especially the mysterious Colonel Templeton, seemed innocent enough at first. Yet it was the way he asked, as if gently prodding open doors better left closed, that left an undercurrent of unease. He asked about Colonel Templeton's strange habits, his sudden isolation from the village, and the abrupt disappearance of a maid named Clara. No one remembered much about Clara, just that she had vanished one afternoon years ago. But Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet intuition, had always known that there was more to the story. On the 4th day of Daniel's stay, a peculiar moment occurred when, while rifling through the shelves in the parlor, he found a letter hidden in a book, yellowed with age. The letter's contents were disturbing. A brief cryptic message hinting at something buried deep in the past, something no one wanted to remember. The atmosphere in the house changed instantly, as if the discovery had released something long contained. Mrs. Harcourt, now feeling an unfamiliar sense of dread, confessed to Miss Marple that Daniel's questions had begun to feel less like research, and more like a quiet threat, like someone searching for something they feared finding. It was then that Miss Marple, sensing the delicate balance of things, began her own investigation, reaching out to old friends in the village, probing at memories long buried. When Daniel requested a private meeting, his confession came with an unsettling calmness. He believed Colonel Templeton had been involved in a cover-up surrounding Clara's disappearance, and the more he dug into the past, the more it seemed someone in the village was hiding the truth. As Miss Marple listened, her expression remained serene, but her mind raced. The kettle whistled in the background, a sharp sound cutting through the tension. She knew the past, once uncovered, had a way of refusing to stay hidden, especially when someone had gone to great lengths to conceal it. The following afternoon, as Miss Marple sat with a group of villagers at the vicarage, a moment of silence fell over the room. When she mentioned Colonel Templeton's name, the room seemed to contract, the atmosphere thick with unspoken thoughts, and Miss Marple's observation about Clara's beauty caused a shift, as though the past was rushing back, unwilling to remain forgotten. As Mrs. Dowling, Miss Parsons, and Mrs. Fitch exchanged quiet, cautious glances, Miss Marple knew they all remembered more than they let on. It was not an open admission, but a shared understanding that something unspeakable had occurred, something that would not be easily undone. The mystery of Clara Templeton had been buried, but Miss Marple was no stranger to finding the hidden, no matter how well it was concealed. In the heart of Little Dithering, beneath the gentle hum of daily village life, there were whispers that Miss Marple could not ignore. The tea party at Mrs. Dowling's had started as an ordinary gathering, but it quickly revealed itself to be a delicate game of unspoken truths. The quiet mention of Clara, the maid who had once served the enigmatic Colonel Templeton, was all it took to shift the mood in the room. No one spoke of her departure. It was as if she had never existed, her shadow erased from memory with deliberate precision. Yet Miss Marple knew that such things were never truly forgotten. Not entirely. It was not just the absence of affection for Clara that intrigued her, but the way the village had collectively chosen not to ask questions. The silence was thick with the residue of something left unresolved, a quiet injustice that lingered in the corners, unseen but palpable. As the conversation shifted away from Clara to more mundane topics like the vagaries of April weather, Miss Marple's mind remained fixed on that elusive name. It wasn't until Mrs. Dowling, ever the gracious host, accidentally broke a teacup that Miss Marple's suspicions grew sharper. The china, though chipped, held a familiar pattern, a faded cobalt band, and a ring of gold that once adorned the cups used by Colonel Templeton. She remembered them well from her solitary visit to Ivy Bank House, a grandness that seemed out of place for a man of modest means. The villagers had long believed that after Clara's disappearance, the Colonel had sold off much of the house's contents, including this very set of china. But here it was, in Mrs. Dowling's possession, as though it had never left the Colonel's house at all. Miss Marple said nothing, but the broken handle she carefully tucked into her bag felt heavy with unspoken secrets. Objects, she knew, had a tendency to reappear when they were least expected, especially when someone wished them to remain forgotten. A week passed before Miss Marple, ever the picture of politeness, found herself at Mrs. Harcourt's house under the pretense of returning a borrowed recipe. The conversation meandered through pleasant topics, but as they sipped tea, Miss Marple gently steered it toward the study, the very room where the Colonel had once locked away his memories. Mrs. Harcourt hesitated before handing over the key, her light laughter masking a deeper unease. "It makes me feel watched," she had said, brushing off her own words as if they were nothing more than idle fancy. Miss Marple entered the study with quiet reverence, her fingers tracing the dust-covered spines of old books, each one holding a story. The room felt still, as though it had been frozen in time, holding its secrets close. She paused near the old writing desk, its crooked angle drawing her attention. Something about the way it was arranged felt wrong, out of place. It wasn't just the dust that clung to the air. It was the feeling of being on the verge of uncovering something that had been carefully hidden, waiting to be found. Miss Marple's keen eyes swept over the room, and she knew that the past, like the fragments of the broken teacup, had not disappeared. It had simply been waiting for someone to piece it together. The mist in Elder Hollow rolled in low and thick that morning, not with the casual drift of weather, but with a hush that felt deliberate, like the village itself was holding its breath. It clung to window panes, coiled through hedges, and swallowed the sound of birdsong until all that remained was a dense muffled silence that unnerved even the most indifferent of souls. Eleanor Brightwell, returning from her morning walk past the crumbling gates of the long-abandoned Delmere house, caught a strange detail in the periphery, a subtle shift in the front door's alignment, as though it had recently been opened and gently eased shut, not slammed or warped by time, but touched by intention. That sensation lodged itself in her thoughts like a splinter, nagging with increasing insistence. Later that evening, beneath the guise of returning a borrowed church hymnal, a copy that hadn't belonged to anyone living for years, she stepped over the threshold, where the scent of lavender, curiously fresh, struck her like a memory she didn't own. Inside, dust layered everything like snowfall, undisturbed, yet it was the wrong kind of stillness, the kind that felt curated, posed, as if waiting for someone to notice what was missing. In the drawing room, beneath a shrouded chaise lounge, she found it, a small depression in the rug that still held warmth when pressed, and nestled within the pile, nearly hidden, a single glass bead, cloudy blue with gold flecks, catching the light like a half-buried secret. She said nothing, merely slipped it into her coat pocket, and left with a tremor in her step. But Eleanor was not a woman to ignore a thread once she had hold of it. That night, she returned to the church alone, keys borrowed from the unsuspecting groundskeeper, and unearthed a brittle birth registry from the late 1800s, an entry scrawled in hurried pen: Constance Delmere, daughter of Margaret Delmere, father unnamed, born in secrecy, and curiously, never baptized. No further entries, no death, no marriage, just silence, as if the girl had been swallowed whole. Eleanor remembered tales of a cousin, who visited the Delmere estate once years ago, young, quiet, withdrawn, and then vanished without mention. The next day, she found Lydia Winslow, the former housekeeper, now living quietly in a nearby cottage with curtains always drawn, and a gaze that flinched at nothing and everything. Over a pot of tea that Lydia barely touched, Eleanor asked, casually at first, about the Delmere girl. Lydia paled, hesitated, then confessed one night she'd heard a furious argument behind the study door, Margaret's voice sharp and cold, the girls cracking, desperate. Hours later, she heard something being dragged down the hallway, slow, heavy, uneven. Then the house had gone silent. She hadn't dared open a door. The next morning, Lydia had been dismissed without reason. No severance, no thanks, just a carriage at dawn. Years later, she still dreamed of the sound. Eleanor returned to the old Delmere house, this time with a lantern and gloves. In the cellar, beneath a stack of rotted crates, she found it, the edge of a rolled-up rug matching the one she had seen years ago in the parlor, but now clearly marked by an ancient dark bloom of rust brown, deep in the fabric, with the faint scent of iron and decay, lingering even after all this time. It hadn't been cleaned, despite the old inventory record she unearthed in parish ledgers, claiming it had been professionally restored and donated. She touched the corner with her gloved hand. It was still faintly damp. That night, sirens pierced the quiet of Elder Hollow for the first time in years. Under the roses behind the estate, roses Lady Delmere had obsessed over, pruning until her fingers bled. Constable Finch unearthed remains wrapped in layers of rotted linen, bones curled like a child asleep. Beside the skull, still tangled in strands of hair, was a hair comb, blue glass, cloudy with age, flecked in the same gold as the bead in Eleanor's pocket. The village reeled, tongues wagging, secrets reawakening like ghosts shaken from slumber. Yet Eleanor, standing at the edge of the crumbling stone path, did not smile. She only watched the house, its windows dark, its doors once again locked, and knew that truth never fades. It buries itself in silence, waits in the walls, clings to the floorboards, and the rugs, and the quietest corners, until someone brave enough dares to follow the whisper that begins it all. And that whisper, she'd come to learn, never lies. It only waits to be heard. The silence that settled over the manor that night crept in like poison, soft, invisible, but deadly, wrapping around the walls with the eerie stillness of a house that knew too much. Everything appeared undisturbed. No broken windows, no splintered wood, nothing out of place, except for one absence that shifted the entire room's weight, the small leather-bound notebook that Ishan Malik had carried with him religiously, scribbling in it after every conversation, turning its pages over like prayer beads, was gone. He had held it even at breakfast, never letting it leave his side, and now, it had vanished. Miss Arthur leaned forward slightly, adjusting the edge of her glove, as if simply smoothing her wrist, and said softly, "He kept notes, about Kamran, about Zara." The young constable blinked. "No notebook found at the scene, ma'am." Arthur only nodded, her lips tightening into a thoughtful line. No forced entry, no visible struggle, yet something very personal had been deliberately taken, and that, she knew, was rarely the work of a stranger. What gave it away wasn't a metaphorical seed, though plenty had been sown, but a real one, small and dusky, stuck stubbornly in the groove of Ishan's left shoe. She noticed it while kneeling to retrieve her handbag, which had been placed near the hearth. The frilled edge of the seed was unmistakable to anyone who had spent a summer planting delphiniums, as Arthur once had. It came from the dry soil near the greenhouse, where the gardener stored early spring sowings. Ishan had walked through that part of the garden late, very late, the night of his death, and he hadn't worn the same coat as that afternoon. Zara had mentioned his regular tweed jacket was still hanging untouched on the hallway hook, so whose coat had he worn? Arthur brought it up to the constable in passing, but he was too preoccupied with paperwork and protocol, so she asked Sadaf the maid, her tone light, as if out of casual interest. Sadaf paled. "I think he borrowed one of the colonel's old coats," she murmured, "from the wardrobe in the study, said it would be warmer." But the colonel's coats had supposedly been packed up and donated years ago. Why was one still there? And more curiously, why had Ishan chosen to wear it? Unless he meant to walk in the colonel's shoes, to be seen as the colonel himself, to summon something buried in the garden's hush. Arthur's thoughts returned to the rug, to the stain, to the porcelain shard like a fragment of memory unwilling to stay lost. The past had not simply returned. It had dressed itself in borrowed clothing, stepped out into the cold, and whispered into the darkness, and someone had heard it, and responded with murder. Grief, Arthur often thought, wore many masks. Some wept loudly, and were fine by evening. Others grew silent, and never spoke again. But Sadaf's grief was of a stranger kind, one too deep for what she claimed to have felt for Ishan, whom she barely knew beyond polite exchanges, and the occasional tea tray. Yet when his death was announced, she broke down in a way that didn't match logic, sobbing, shaking, found later in the scullery, clutching the apron she'd worn the day before like it might still hold answers. Miss Arthur had spoken to her only twice before, both times brief and uneventful, but now as she stood quietly in the doorway, watching Sadaf's trembling shoulders, she saw something else, sorrow not born of this death, but unearthed by it, something long buried, finally loosened by tragedy. Grief, after all, was often a key, not to mourning, but to memory, and Miss Arthur knew now. Sadaf's sorrow came not from what had happened, but from what it had awakened. Within Miss Marple, as quiet and observant as a still pond masking the currents beneath, stirred a certainty she could neither dismiss nor explain. Not yet. In all her years spent in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, she had learned an immutable truth. Maids and gardeners often held fragments of the story no one dared piece together, fragments soaked in fear and glimpsed truths they buried deeper than any grave. It was just after the subdued hush of morning prayers that Miss Marple found herself wandering past the thick side hedge, bordering Ivy Bank House, her step unhurried, her gaze serene, though her mind churned like a tide under moonlight. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, and the coming promise of rain. The sky hung low, grey and patient. From behind the laurels came the soft snipping of pruning shears. Mr. Beechcraft, the estate gardener, working with the quiet rhythm of a man who had long made peace with silence. She greeted him with her usual kind civility, her voice as light as a breeze, but edged with intent, asking gently if he might spare a moment. Naturally he did. Few in the village could ever refuse Miss Marple, not because she insisted, but because her manner held a grace that compelled. She asked, as always, after the dahlias, how they were faring in the changing season, then inquired after the orchard, the frost's damage, the signs of new growth, all while letting her eyes drift, not obviously, never obviously, toward the forgotten path half swallowed by ivy, the one that led to the old root cellar door. No one seemed to speak of any more. I wonder, she mused softly, whether Mr. Claiborne ever found his way down there. He did have an eye for old architecture, and such places seemed to call to those with minds shaped by history. There was a pause, subtle, but telling before Mr. Beechcraft admitted he'd seen something. A flicker of light, he said, 2 nights ago. Might have been a torch, or maybe just a reflection, but it had seemed wrong, out of place, considering the door hadn't been opened in years. Miss Marple merely nodded, her expression unreadable, though within her, suspicion coiled tighter. Forgotten paths she had found were often remembered only by those who had reason to revisit them, and if they did, especially when the rest of the world had moved on, it usually meant something had been left behind. The next afternoon she returned, once again disguised as a casual inquiry, this time about rhubarb crowns, letting her questions meander, giving Beechcraft space to speak. It worked. Yes, he said slowly, nodding toward the path behind the orchard, where the weeds had begun to reclaim the earth. I did see him, Mr. Claiborne, just standing there, book in hand, not looking at the flowers. No, just still, like he was trying to remember something he'd buried. That line struck her, buried. It lingered in her mind as she made her way the following morning to the abandoned greenhouse, now little more than a shell clinging to memory. Once the pride of Colonel Templeton's estate, filled with rare orchids and delicate ferns, it had become a tomb for forgotten beauty. The door creaked in protest as she pushed it open, and inside, despite the dust, there was no chaos, just a quiet, eerie tidiness, like someone had been there in secret moments. A bench stood at the back, half shadowed by an overturned watering can, and on it lay a faded cushion. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The cushion had been recently straightened, moth-nibbled at the edges, yes, but lovingly placed. She brushed it gently, her fingers uncovering crude but recent stitching in the corner. D.C. Daniel Claiborne. The thread was bright, new, unfaded like the surrounding fabric. Someone had added it recently. It was not the mark of nostalgia, she thought, but of ownership, or guilt, because no one marks what they've left behind, unless they expect someone might one day come looking. The cushion at first glance seemed like just another forgotten remnant, in the dust-laden solitude of the old greenhouse, its once rich burgundy hue now reduced to a weary, almost embarrassed pink by decades of unrelenting sunlight, its stuffing uneven, sunken in parts, as though time itself had pressed memories into its very fabric. To the untrained eye, it would have been dismissed as irrelevant, a cast-off of comfort in a place long abandoned by comfort itself. But Miss Marple, ever attuned to the quiet language of forgotten things, noticed instantly what others would overlook. The cushion did not belong. It bore the wear of age, yes, but the monogram stitched into one frayed corner was far too recent, too deliberate. D.C. The letters stood out, harsh in their rushed embroidery, as though the act of stitching had been done in secret and in haste, not with care, but with an urgency born of need or fear. Daniel Claiborne. It wasn't just a name, it was a breadcrumb in a forest of silence, and Miss Marple, with years of delicate unraveling behind her, knew the scent of buried truths when they lingered in the air like wilted perfume. She turned the cushion over with a gentle firmness, her fingers, still nimble despite the soft ache in her knuckles, tracing the seam where the fabric had been clumsily reopened and restitched. The thread was jagged, uneven, like the heartbeat of someone panicked, someone who had torn something open not out of curiosity, but desperation, and then attempted to seal it back shut with trembling hands. It was an act not of repair, but concealment. And concealment, Miss Marple knew, was the favorite cousin of guilt. Her breath caught faintly, not in fear, but in recognition. Daniel hadn't come here for the plants or peace. He had come because something in this decaying greenhouse still held something hidden. Perhaps quite literally. The air inside was thick, not just with moisture but with memory. Moss clung to the corners like a creeping past. Vines etched their stories along the cracked glass panes above, and the scent of earth mixed with old grief. Miss Marple slowly stood, every creak of her knees echoed by the groan of the wooden floor beneath her feet. She adjusted the cushion gently back in place, but as she did, a faint, muffled knock reverberated beneath the bench, barely audible, but unmistakably intentional. It wasn't the sound of age or rot, it was the sound of something waiting. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. She tapped lightly along the wooden slats, each knock answering her with its own note, until one replied with a hollow thud, a sound that hinted at absence beneath. With careful precision, she knelt and pried open the panel, her fingers brushing away decades of dust to reveal a compartment swallowed by shadows. She reached in and pulled out a bundle, wrapped in brittle oilskin, bound tightly with twine that disintegrated at her touch, like it had been holding its breath all these years, waiting for someone to finally set it free. Inside, folded like a relic, was a diary, plain, cloth-bound, its brown cover stained by age, yet intact, except where a name had once been etched, and then violently rubbed away, leaving behind only the ghost of identity. Miss Marple held it as one might hold a long-lost letter from the dead, with reverence, with dread, with the sense that the world might tilt, if the contents were read too quickly. She opened the first page. The scent of ink and mildew rose like a spirit, thick and intimate. The handwriting was elegant but strained, the script delicate in parts, hurried in others. And then she saw it. Clara. The voice that emerged from the pages was soft at first, cloaked in the mundane details of domestic life, laundry notes, cleaning rotas, observations about the Colonel's infuriating tea preferences. But it wasn't long before the tone shifted, first with subtle weight, then with an unshakable gravity. Clara, it became clear, had not simply been a maid in this house. She had loved, deeply, and dangerously, not with the naive blush of a passing infatuation, but with a consuming forbidden ache, a love starved of light and legitimacy, hidden beneath the heavy drapes of class and power. There had been promises, private ones, sacred ones, and then broken ones. Clara spoke of a letter she was supposed to receive, one that never came. She spoke of a man who held her with words in secret, but abandoned her with silence in daylight. And then, whispered between the lines, was a child, unnamed, a flickering presence in the diary, like a candle kept burning in the back of a locked drawer. Clara never used the language of rage. What she described was worse: shame, isolation, fear. The Colonel had known, she said, not because he accused her, but because he didn't. Because his kindness became a curtain. Because the money in her palm came without eye contact. Because she was expected to disappear, as if she'd never existed, carrying her silence like a second skin. And then the entries darkened. The pen strokes grew heavier, the loops less precise. Clara had overheard something dangerous. A conversation in the Colonel's study, murmured but sharp, male and female voices clashing in low tones, names exchanged like weapons, hers included. And then H, a name without context, a threat without shape. Clara hadn't understood the full weight of what she had stumbled upon, only that she had been made into a pawn, or worse, a scapegoat. But in the final entry, her tone changed again. It became steady, certain. If anyone finds this, she wrote, No, I never meant to fall in love. But I won't be quiet anymore. Tonight, I tell her. No name, no elaboration, just a thick blot of ink at the end, as though the pen had been yanked away, or her hand had faltered at the last moment, cut off mid-thought, mid-decision, mid-life. Miss Marple sat in silence, the diary warm in her lap, despite the coldness it carried. She could feel Clara's presence, nervous, breathless, the diary trembling in candlelight, heart pounding with the unbearable need to speak. This was not just a diary, it was a reckoning, a map through the elegant lies and carefully tended decay of the estate. The house had tried to forget Clara. The people in it had buried her truth beneath layers of propriety, charity, and shame. But truth, real truth, does not rot. It lingers, it festers, it waits for someone to dig deep enough to bleed again. And Miss Marple, with her unyielding patience and unwavering gaze, knew one thing for certain. As she gently closed the diary, Clara's story wasn't over. Not yet. The house might have turned its back. But she would not. She would follow every thread, every whisper, every silence, until the truth, long sealed and suffocating, was finally allowed to breathe. The knock on the greenhouse floor had not merely disturbed the dust. It had stirred something far deeper, something that had been buried beneath layers of time, deceit, and intentional forgetting. It was a truth that Clara had once dared to speak aloud, her voice a mere whisper against the deafening silence of years, but had never lived to fully reveal. The shadows of that secret, now long undisturbed, were once again rising to the surface. Miss Marple, her fingertips still tingling with the residual echo of Clara's final inked confession, felt a cold certainty settle over her. The same truth had been uncovered by Daniel Claiborne, and in his pursuit of it, he had paid the ultimate price. Now his absence left an unsettling silence in its wake. The connection between them, fragile but undeniable, pulsed through the air, a quiet thread that tied their fates together in a delicate knot. Outside, beyond the cracked and distorted panes of the greenhouse, the lilacs stirred in the softest of winds, their petals trembling, as if in silent warning. But it wasn't the onset of spring that rippled the air. It was something far more ominous. It was the weight of reckoning, a tide that had been slowly rising, unnoticed, until it was almost upon them. The village, in its tranquil and seemingly unchanging peace, was about to be shaken from its years of genteel denial. It had been waiting for a truth that had remained hidden for far too long, its presence felt but unacknowledged. The arrival of Lady Evangeline Carradine in Little Dithering was marked not by excitement or joy, but by an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere, an undercurrent of curiosity that spread like ink through the town's veins. She was a woman of poise, an elegant, chilling presence whose very name conjured images of old aristocracy and forgotten lineage. Her arrival stirred no fanfare, no celebration, only a hushed whisper that seemed to follow her every step, like the rustle of pages in a long-forgotten book. Lady Evangeline was not a figure that invited warmth. Instead, she exuded a cold grace, a refinement that veiled a deeper, sharper purpose. Her eyes, scanning the village with a certain familiarity, suggested she was not visiting for the first time but returning, as though she had never truly left. Her reason for being there was ostensibly genealogical, a vague connection to the Templeton bloodline, buried in the annals of time, its details obscured by generations of neglect. But Miss Marple, ever vigilant and attuned to the subtleties of human behavior, sensed something far more deliberate in her presence. There was no casual curiosity in Lady Evangeline's manner. She was not merely searching for long-lost relatives. She was searching for something far more elusive, something that lay buried beneath the Templeton family's carefully constructed facade. As the days passed, Lady Evangeline's inquiries became more pointed, more precise. She asked questions that seemed innocent enough, about family portraits, ancient papers, and the domestic arrangements of the Templeton household. But it was the way she asked, the subtle emphasis she placed on certain details, that raised Miss Marple's suspicions. She seemed particularly interested in the staff, who they were, where they had come from, and most curiously, where they had gone. Her charm was impeccable, smooth as velvet, but Miss Marple could sense the cold edge beneath it, the mechanical precision of someone whose every word was calculated to disarm and manipulate. There was no warmth in Lady Evangeline's smile, only a calculated patience, as if she were playing a game with stakes far higher than anyone in the village could imagine. It was during one of the afternoon teas, hosted by the vicar's wife, that Miss Marple's suspicions were confirmed. The warm, languid air of the day pressed down on the gathering, and the clink of china and polite conversation created an almost perfect illusion of normalcy. Yet, as Lady Evangeline casually quoted a line, "I never meant to fall in love, but I won't be quiet anymore," something in the room shifted. The words hung in the air, almost innocuous in their simplicity, but to Miss Marple, they struck like a thunderclap. These were not just any words, they were Clara's words, from her private diary, hidden away for years, shared with only a few. Miss Marple had read them herself, just days before, as she pored over Clara's final confessional notes. How did Lady Evangeline know them? The question slammed into Miss Marple's mind, and the realization was as cold as a winter wind. The woman sitting across from her, so poised, so immaculate in her calculated elegance, had not come to little dithering, to uncover family ties or genealogical connections. No, she had come for something far more dangerous. Lady Evangeline's eyes met Miss Marple's across the room, and in that fleeting moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. Miss Marple knew, with absolute certainty, that this woman was not searching for the truth. She was attempting to bury it once again. The truth about Clara, the truth about Daniel. And now, with Lady Evangeline poised to strike, the past long buried and forgotten, was clawing its way back to the surface, threatening to expose secrets far more volatile than anyone in the village could have anticipated. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her teacup, her grip steady, not from age, but from a deep, resolute understanding. This time, she would not let the truth slip away again. This time, the story would be heard. The quiet click of Lady Honoria's heels on the polished floor was the only sound that followed her, as she made her way through the parlor, her every movement poised and deliberate, like a dancer performing a well-rehearsed routine. But Miss Marple, ever the observant one, knew that beneath this perfect exterior lay something more, something hidden, something shifting just beneath the surface of her charming facade. The moment Lady Honoria had quoted Clara's words, the air had thickened with a sudden tension. It was as if time itself had stopped for just a moment, and in that fleeting stillness, Miss Marple had sensed the weight of something old and dangerous, creeping back into the present. Clara's diary, so carefully concealed for decades, had been unearthed, and now those words, "I never meant to fall in love, but I won't be quiet anymore," had been spoken once more, but this time by a stranger. That alone was enough to make the hairs on the back of Miss Marple's neck stand on end. Had Lady Honoria read the diary herself? Had she known its contents long before stepping foot in the village? Or had someone else whispered its secrets to her? Whatever the truth, it was clear that Lady Honoria's interest in Clara was not casual. It was calculated, precise, and laden with hidden intent. Miss Marple's mind raced as she quietly considered the possibilities. She had always prided herself on her ability to unravel the most tangled of webs, and she now found herself faced with one that was far more intricate than she had first imagined. As the afternoon tea continued, Miss Marple engaged Lady Honoria in conversation, keeping her tone light, her demeanor cordial, but every word, every glance, was a subtle probe into the woman's true motives. Lady Honoria's responses, while polished and graceful, were just a bit too rehearsed, as if she had perfected this act over years of practice. She spoke of Colonel Templeton, a man whose life Miss Marple knew well, but there was a flicker of hesitation when she recounted her brief acquaintance with him. The details, or lack thereof, bothered Miss Marple. The Colonel, a man of few but memorable engagements, was not one to entertain without the village knowing, yet Lady Honoria spoke of him as though their association had been commonplace, casual. A closer look at her words revealed a careful avoidance of specific details, an effort to obscure the truth beneath a veil of vague recollections. The more Lady Honoria spoke, the more Miss Marple could see the artifice in her narrative, the cracks in the facade she so carefully crafted. The tale she wove was beautiful, polished, but hollow. It was a fiction designed to placate, to reassure, but Miss Marple could see the lie in its smoothness. As the conversation came to a close, Lady Honoria left the vicarage with her usual grace, her movements as fluid and composed as ever. But just before she departed, Miss Marple noticed something, a small, almost imperceptible object, resting on the floor at the foot of the door. It was a crisp white card, edged in silver gilt, a calling card, a card that had slipped from Lady Honoria's hand perhaps by accident, or perhaps not. Miss Marple bent down and picked it up, her fingers barely brushing the delicate edges. The front of the card bore Lady Honoria's name, elegant and understated, but it was the back that caught Miss Marple's attention. A faint, hurried pencil scrawl marred the otherwise pristine surface, a scribbled message that seemed almost too deliberate to be a mistake. As Miss Marple turned the card over in her hands, her gaze sharpened, her mind racing to make sense of this new piece of the puzzle. What had Lady Honoria left behind? And why? One thing was certain, whatever secrets Lady Honoria had come to uncover, or perhaps bury, the truth was far from the elegant story she had so carefully spun. With a quiet determination, Miss Marple placed the card in her pocket, knowing that this was just the beginning. The past, buried beneath layers of deception and false smiles, was finally starting to reveal itself, and Miss Marple was ready to follow the trail wherever it led. As the delicate card lingered in Miss Marple's hand, the weight of its message pressed heavily upon her. Clara's child had survived. The hastily scrawled words, written with a sharp urgency, left no doubt that they were meant for no eyes but the writer's own. The ink, smeared slightly in places as though written in a frenzy, was a stark contrast to the otherwise pristine elegance of Lady Honoria's world. The truth was now undeniable. Daniel Claiborne, with his probing questions and the mysterious notebook, was not merely a bystander. He was Clara's child, the very son who had been hidden away from the scandal, the whispers, the damning silence of the past. The implications of this revelation twisted through Miss Marple's mind, each thread connecting a previously unknowable part of the puzzle. The man who had once sought answers was the very one whose existence had been obscured by a tangled web of secrecy and lies. Lady Honoria, with her carefully constructed demeanor, had known. She had uncovered the truth, or perhaps she had always been aware, silently holding on to the knowledge that Daniel's quest was more than a mere search for information. It was a pursuit of his own blood, a pursuit of identity. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the card as she slipped it into her cardigan pocket, the past speaking louder than ever. As the village moved in its unchanging rhythm, the vicarage gatherings, the tea ceremonies, and the morning post, the revelation hung in the air like a storm cloud, hovering just above the surface of their ordinary lives. The villagers, each in their own way, began to feel the quiet gravity of their shared understanding, a truth that was once buried beneath layers of politeness and propriety. Lady Honoria's departure, escorted with the grace of someone who had expected this moment, did not bring the dramatic climax that many might have anticipated. Instead, it came in quiet, measured steps, a subdued acknowledgement that justice, when it arrived, often did so without the theatrical flourish one might expect. The car, moving slowly down the lane, became a symbol of the inevitable truth that had finally found its voice. Yet even as she disappeared from sight, the whispers in Little Dithering intensified. The villagers, who had once exchanged pleasantries with a lightness that disguised the weight of unspoken truths, now moved with a new awareness. Mrs. Dowling's tea gatherings grew quieter, the vicar's sermons more reflective, his words now carefully chosen, as if the weight of forgiveness had become more personal, more immediate. Even the grocer, Mrs. Fitch, moved with a gentler hand, the clink of sugar and tea leaves softer, her eyes reflecting a thoughtfulness that was once absent. Miss Marple understood the transformation completely. The village, despite its polite airs and superficial calm, had been irrevocably altered. The past had slithered its way back into the present, and now it rested not in the hushed corners of secrets, but in the shared consciousness of all who lived there. The quiet, subtle weight of truth, unveiled, undeniable, and deeply uncomfortable, pressed upon every conversation, every glance, every action. The villagers knew, even if they did not speak of it aloud, that the delicate fabric of their society had been tested, but not broken. And as the days passed, they would learn to adjust to this new reality, where even the most carefully guarded secrets could no longer remain hidden, and the echoes of the past would forever ring in the undercurrents of their lives. Emmeline Harcourt stood in the quiet solitude of her parlour, her eyes lingering on the faint yet unmistakable stain that marred the floorboards beneath her feet. It had been years since the incident, but the mark was stubborn, as though it had become part of the wood itself, a permanent reminder of the past that refused to let go. The rest of the floor gleamed under the soft light of the evening, polished to perfection, but the stain lingered, unyielding, almost defiant. She bent down with the quiet reverence of one who knew the importance of even the smallest gesture, lifting the heavy rug that had been laid over the floor. As her fingers pressed the fabric into place, smoothing it out with a meticulous hand, there was a momentary pause. Her eyes traced the edges of the rug, and with an almost imperceptible decision, she left one corner turned back, as though to mark the floor beneath. The deliberate choice was no accident. It was a statement, a quiet refusal to fully erase the past, to fully conceal the truth, no matter how much time had passed. The stain, now partially exposed, was no longer just a blemish. It had become a symbol, small but unyielding. Emmeline, in that single moment, was acknowledging the truth that lay beneath the surface. And it wasn't just the stain she was exposing, it was a truth that could no longer be hidden, a truth that demanded to be seen, even if only by those who were willing to notice. Miss Marple, who had come to understand the subtle power of small, seemingly insignificant actions, observed Emmeline's choice with quiet approval. She, too, knew that there were things in this world that could never be fully concealed, no matter how artfully they were covered. The rug, she thought, was not just a piece of furniture, nor was the stain just a blemish on the floor. They were symbols of the delicate balance between appearance and reality, between the stories we tell ourselves and the truths we bury in silence. The turned-up corner of the rug was a defiant, yet humble, act of revelation. It was a subtle protest against the ease with which the village had covered its own uncomfortable truths. Miss Marple understood this instinctively. The rug, she mused, was a reflection of the village's own struggle with its dark secrets, the way its residents had, for years, swept uncomfortable truths under the rug, so to speak, burying them beneath layers of politeness and decorum. But now, with that single turned-up corner, Emmeline had silently proclaimed that the truth could not, and would not, be buried forever. In her own quiet way, she was reminding everyone who noticed that some truths were too powerful to remain hidden. As Miss Marple sat in her garden later that afternoon, her fingers moving methodically through the tangled skeins of wool, her mind drifted back to the events that had led her here. She thought of Clara, whose tragic fate had remained shrouded in silence for far too long, her secrets held tight in the pages of a forgotten diary. She thought of Daniel, whose pursuit of justice had cost him dearly, and of Lady Honoria, whose polished image had been shattered, not by an explosive revelation, but by the quiet erosion of her own lies. The village had, in its own way, come to terms with the fact that the past, no matter how neatly tucked away, would never stay buried forever. The stain on Emmeline's floorboards, like the secrets that had once been hidden beneath Ivy Bankhouse's walls, was a reminder of the past that would not be silenced. It would resurface, slowly, inexorably, until it was acknowledged, until the truth was forced into the light. Miss Marple mused on the nature of justice, as she watched the sunlight dance across the petals of her flowers, their soft colors, a stark contrast to the complexities of human nature. Justice, she knew, was never swift or clean. It didn't arrive with fanfare or dramatic revelations. Instead, it moved quietly, gathering strength beneath the surface, unseen until the moment of truth could no longer be denied. It was in the hushed whispers of the village that justice had taken root, growing slowly in the shadows, until it had pushed through the barriers of denial and secrecy. Lady Honoria's carefully constructed world had cracked open, not with a single dramatic revelation, but through a steady accumulation of small truths that had finally been acknowledged. And now the village was left with the quiet aftermath, an awareness that would forever change the way they saw one another, and themselves. As Miss Marple sat in the tranquility of her garden, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, she allowed herself a small smile. The world, she thought, was full of hidden truths, beneath the silks of social decorum, beneath the layers of respectability. There were always secrets waiting to be uncovered. Some of those secrets would be forced into the light, whether the world was ready for them or not. She glanced over toward Ivy Bank House, its elegant facade now a silent witness to the storm that had passed through. Beneath its calm exterior, Miss Marple knew, the lessons of the past would endure. The stain on Emmeline's floorboards, the turned-up corner of the rug, it was all part of the same story, the same quiet unfolding of a truth that could no longer be ignored. And though the villagers had returned to their daily lives, there was a new understanding in the air, an unspoken recognition that some things could no longer be hidden. The truth, like the flowers in Miss Marple's garden, would always find its way to the surface. The question that lingered in the back of Miss Marple's mind was a simple one. What if Clara's diary had never been discovered? Would the truth have remained buried, hidden beneath layers of secrecy and silence? Or would fate, in its quiet, unrelenting way, have found another path to bring the truth to light? It was a question that would haunt the corners of her mind long after the last stitch was made in her knitting. A reminder that truth, much like the seasons, had a way of coming around again. And so as Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her thoughts drifting like the gentle breeze through her garden, she left us with one final question. If you had been in her place, would you have left the past buried? Or would you have uncovered the truth, no matter the cost? Would you, like Emmeline, have let a corner of the rug remain turned up, just enough to remind the world that some truths can never be fully concealed? It is a question like the hidden stains beneath the surface, that will remain forever unanswered, lingering in the quiet, waiting for someone brave enough to find the courage to uncover it.